So this week's lecture is on education and also the military as kind of an alternative to education. And education has become more and more important. Parents kind of realize the importance of education and are really focusing on that in terms of their kids. One of the big things we're seeing is there's more and more money spent on pre-college education. And what seems to be happening is parents kind of realize the importance of education but don't know what to do about it, so they keep spending more money. We see things like private high schools, tutoring, extracurriculars, all those things are things that parents spend money on. And college degrees are more and more being seen as kind of a necessity, not a luxury. So we'll talk about the pros and cons of those. But in general, we do see a lot of general benefits to college: better health, longer life expectancy, increased professional mobility, improved personal status, and improved quality of life for offspring. So definitely a lot of positive things associated with attending college. But one of the questions is, is it worth the cost to attend college? And this graph is showing this line right here is the line for college graduates, and this is the hourly wages, and you can see that there was a pretty dramatic increase for everyone, but particularly for college graduates in the late 90s. This only goes to 2004. But what you can see is, despite the fact that there were increases in tuition during this time, the wages of college graduates have increased pretty dramatically, while the wages of high school dropouts and non-graduates has not increased as quickly, and so it appears to be worth it. Kind of a different approach to this is arguing that college is worth it if it boosts your lifetime salary by at least the total lost wages in tuition and fees. So the biggest economic cost is in tuition, which averages about $30,000 a year. This is in 2003 dollars, so a little while ago. But we also have to take into account the lost wages that you would have made had you been working for the 4 years you were in school. So the total cost of college is estimated to be about $107,000. If you look at the annual lifetime wages, it's much higher than those non-college. So the net value of a college education is almost $300,000, and so the average college student recoups their investment within about 10 years of graduation. So it does still appear to be worth it. Now, there's another big issue associated with college, which is that a lot of emerging adults drop out. The range is somewhere between 25 and 45% of incoming college first-year students never graduate. When I entered my college orientation, they told us, look at the person to your left and your right. One of you won't be here when you graduate, because they had a dropout rate of about 1 in 3. So this is from a study that used basically industrial organizational psych principles to predict who would stay in college. Normally these methods are used to predict who will stay at a job, but they use the same principles to predict who would stay in college. And one of the strongest predictors was just asking them, do they plan to stay? So many students who end up not staying know that they're not going to stay from the very beginning. They also looked, though, at students who stayed versus left within the first 3 semesters. And kind of the biggest thing they found was students who stayed were more embedded in the institution. They were more of a part of the institution. So they had higher social support, so they really valued kind of the opinions of others at the college. They had more to lose if they left the college. They felt like there was a better fit between the college and their career goals, or between themselves and the faculty and the department. They really felt like they meshed with the school that they were at. And they also had higher organizational commitment. So things like, I'm proud to tell other people that I go to this college. And so really feeling like you're a part of the school seems to be a very strong predictor of success. However, there are also attitudinal things. So this is a little complex, but this is from a study, again looking at predicting college retention, and the main variable that they were interested in is, does academic optimism predict college retention? So if you feel more optimistic about your success in college, are you more likely to stay? And what they found was yes, and it works in a couple of ways. So one is, the more academically optimistic you are, the more motivation you have. Motivation directly improves GPA. Motivation also makes you less likely to experience distress. And when you have more motivation, a higher GPA, and less distress, all of those things make you more likely to stay. And the impressive thing about this is these kind of attitudinal or psychological variables remain true even when you take into account kind of traditional predictors of college success, things like high school GPA and ACT scores. They're very strong predictors. So if you're optimistic about success, you keep going until a goal is accomplished, which means you actually have more success, which then is kind of a positive cycle, which makes you more optimistic in the future. Okay, so some students choose not to go to a traditional college, but another kind of growing option that we're seeing is there are more and more jobs that require at least an associate's degree, and those jobs are actually growing twice as fast as jobs requiring no degree. And so community college is often the best way to get an associate's degree. And traditionally, the associate's degree is thought of as kind of more focused on training for work. There's kind of a couple of functions for this in addition to just training for work. Sometimes students who weren't as good as in high school can kind of use an associate's degree to kind of catch up before they search out for or try for a 4-year degree. They also can use it to kind of figure out their interests. If they have no idea what they want to do, by taking some classes and earning an associate's degree at a community college, it can kind of help them give themselves more direction. And among the community college population, you see more older students, more lower income students, and more minority students. And we do know kind of the things that predict failure at a community college level are planning to leave. So again, just like a 4-year college, planning to leave is not a good sign. Also not having a good sense of the future are all associated with more failure. One of the common issues that you see in community college classes is students don't really take a coherent set of classes, and they're kind of ambivalent at school. They're not sure how they feel, and those students are much more likely to drop out. The problem becomes when they drop out, they go into jobs that don't pay very well because they don't have a degree, and sometimes that even leads them to go back to community colleges, and so you get this kind of cycle that can lead to debt problems, which we'll talk about when we talk about finances. Okay. I also like to talk about graduate school kind of briefly and things to do to succeed in college and to kind of think about before graduate school. These are kind of tips, kind of anecdotal tips as opposed to more formalized tips. But I assume at least some of you are considering this for your own educational goals. So one of the big things to think about for graduate school is to set long-term goals. Don't just think about graduate school as the end goal. Think about potential career options. So what you want to think about is, okay, I want to go to graduate school. What are the majors and classes that will help me achieve this goal? What out-of-class experiences will help this? And what kind of graduate education will help you achieve your career goals? And just a really important note is to look at the graduate program requirements before you plan to apply. So don't wait until the spring of your senior year to start looking at grad program requirements. Some of them require certain classes or minors that your major might not require, and so these kinds of things are important to know early. So these are bad reasons that I've heard for going to graduate school. One is I can't find a job. It's important to remember that a graduate degree doesn't guarantee that a job will be waiting for you. Depending on your field, you could potentially be getting yourself into a lot of debt, and debt and no job is not a good sign. It's just the next logical step. It's important to remember that just because you enjoyed undergrad doesn't mean that it's a good idea to go to grad school. I would say I kind of did this, and I got kind of halfway through graduate school and realized I hadn't even really thought of my career options. So kind of taking a step back and thinking about that career option is really important. To make money, grad school often gets you in a lot of debt, so it's important to kind of consider the potential salary versus the potential student loan debt. And there's actually been kind of a trend where the government has shut down a couple of graduate programs because what's happening is they cost too much for students to realistically pay back based on what they can make once they graduate. So Graduate school is not necessarily the key to making a ton of money. Also, just to help people and find yourself is not a great reason. Good reasons to go to graduate school are things like, this is the next step in the career I want, I've talked to someone in the field and I understand the day-to-day job requirements and this is what I'd like to do, or I'm really interested in the topic and I'm willing to sacrifice my time, money, and maybe my soul to learn more about it. So graduate school is hard and you want to be sure before you go in. So know what you want to do when you graduate from grad school before going in. That's really important. Okay, you've got several videos and readings kind of discussing the main issues in terms of the military, but I just had kind of a couple other things to think about. And you've got a video on gender in the military, but the military has many more men than women. Up until 2016, women were limited in what kind of roles they could have, but eventually, finally, now all jobs are open to women. And there's been, before making this decision, they did a number of studies kind of looking at the impact of women in combat. For example, one study looked at military returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and found no gender differences associated with combat-related stressors or post-deployment adjustment. There's been studies looking at kind of the impact on troop morale and performance, and generally it does not seem to have an impact. One thing we do see, though, is high and increasingly high, probably because it's being reported more, rates of sexual assault in the military. So we have a video about that as well, because that's a growing problem. Okay, sexual orientation is another kind of important thing to think about. Before 1993, gays were prohibited from being in the military, and then in 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was passed. And the idea was basically just don't share about your sexuality and it won't become a problem. But it was still very common to see harassment based on assumed sexual orientation. The trick was we couldn't directly study the effects because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So identifying individuals as sexual minorities would have put them at risk. So we didn't have kind of a clear identification. This has been overturned, though. And this graph is just from an article looking at saying basically that most people disapprove of the ban on sexual minorities serving in the military, but you see differences depending on the wording, which is kind of interesting, but still the majority agreed. And so I've got a video on kind of the history of gay men in the military. And you have an article that does a really good job kind of talking about this, but just some things to think about in terms of benefits and risks. There's a lot of education benefits through the GI Bill. That means that currently many veterans are better educated than their non-veteran counterparts. Education benefits mean there's more military and higher education, and it's really important because they need skills and employment afterwards. In terms of risk, PTSD and traumatic brain injuries and suicide and depression are all very common factors, especially in military vets. So about 14% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans screened positive for depression, another 14% for PTSD, so very common. The suicide rates are much higher than the general population. Particularly male veterans are twice as likely as non-veterans to die by suicide. And a lot of this has to do with a lack of services, particularly for psychological problems. So there's definitely an issue with getting services to these veterans. We also see an interesting thing with divorce rates, where they're lower than average while in the service or deployed, but higher than average when leaving the service. So it seems like they do okay when they have the structure or support of the military, which kind of buffers against a breakup, but veterans' marriages suffer. And we also see a surprisingly high number of military families getting SNAP benefits or food stamps. So there are some financial issues as well. All right, and that is it for this week.